Great. All right. Well, I do want to be respectful of everybody's time this afternoon, and we have just about everyone here. So good afternoon, everyone. I'm Scarlett Hoey. I'm with the New England Museum Association. My colleague Heather from NEMA is on here as well. Like I mentioned, you can feel free to go ahead and say hello in the chat feature. We are in meeting mode in Zoom, which means you are able to unmute yourselves. So at the end of this workshop, we do have time set aside for a Q&A. And in that Q&A, you can either pop your question into the chat feature of the Q&A box, or you can raise your hand and unmute. And we'd love to hear from you. So here at NEMA, we know that virtual spaces cannot replace the lands that sustain and empower us. I'm here at home in Worcester, Massachusetts, homelands of the Nipmuc Nation people and their allied tribes, past and present. NEMA recognizes that our organization and those of our members were founded within a colonizing society, which continues the exclusions and erasures of many Indigenous peoples throughout New England and beyond. I'm going to drop a link into the chat, which is the Indigenous Peoples land map, which you can use to locate the lands where you are zooming in from or where your museum is located. And I'm also going to drop another quick link for an article that NEMA has about a guide to land acknowledgements, which I encourage folks to read. I'm super excited to be here in space with you all this afternoon to talk about telling the whole history, archives, and actions. We have three really wonderful presenters. Before we get going, though, I do want to run a quick poll. I'm going to start the poll. It should be launched. There's two questions. One is, where is your museum in the process of telling more expansive stories? And two, what is the greatest challenge to this work at your site? So we're just going to give it a minute. And if y'all could fill in the poll, that would be great, just to see where everyone's landing with this work. And I know technically, it could be multiple choice, but we have to pick one answer. So. We're just about at a minute, so I'll give it another couple seconds. Cool. Well, it looks like 87% of you have participated. Thank you so much. So I'm going to end the poll now. And it looks like for where is your museum in the process of telling more expansive stories, we have about 33% of you haven't started yet, but you're excited to learn. Perfect. Thank you for being here. About 19% have begun research, which is great. And we're tied between developing content and prototyping tours and currently exhibiting and presenting some of these histories at 24% each. So it sounds like a really great mix of everyone landing here today. And then for what are the greatest challenges? Ooh, this is always exciting to see. Our number one is limited time, way outweighing everything else at 67%. Second up, we have finances at 19%. Community receptiveness at 10%, and internal resistance to change at 5%. So you all should be able to see those results too for visual learners. So I'm going to stop sharing the poll results. Thank you all for taking the time to fill out the poll. And I'm going to turn it over to our wonderful first speaker, which is Ruth Taylor.
Hi, everyone. I'm Ruth Taylor. I'm the Executive Director of the Newport Historical Society in Newport, Rhode Island. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen for just a couple of slides. I wanted to start by saying something about the sort of philosophical context in which we began this work, and also the landscape of thinking about, in particular, history of Black people and the enslaved in Newport, Rhode Island. I want to say that we all always, and certainly historians deal with this all the time, see the world through the lens that's constructed of various elements, our personalities, our culture, what we've been taught, whatever preconceptions we drag into it when we're looking at something, and we can literally not see something that's right before our eyes because the lens filters it out. or we're just not expecting to see it. And I want to argue here that the notion that people of color do not exist in the documentary record is one of those preconceptions. And that preconception is in many ways one of the first impediments people discover when they try to do this work. And I still hear people say this all the time. There was a wonderful exhibit at the American Craft Museum, and the promo for the exhibit says, in essence, people of color don't appear in the documentary record, so we have to rely on conjecture and reconstruction and imagination to tell their stories. And so I'm arguing that that's not true. And I'm arguing that that's also led, in particular, when we think about slavery, to this notion that we're going to talk about numbers, we're going to talk about the slave trade, we're going to talk about ships, we're going to talk about people on ships. And that emphasis is, again, on the enslaver, on the powerful, on the system, and it does not allow us to tell the stories of people because we think we can't. One more layer to context as we began this work, which is that in Newport in particular, there's incredible myth making, not just in Newport, in all of America, but incredible myth making about the past. And so in the 19th century, prominent citizens, whether consciously or not, wanted to create a vision of the past where slavery did not prevent certain exceptional Black people from playing an important role in the community. So they built into their histories of the city these biographies of certain exceptional people, like Newport Gardner, who was, we are told, an African prince whose mother thought he was coming to America for an education, but it was instead enslaved by Caleb Gardner. And he became, we're told, a prominent musician and music teacher and a pillar of the community. So these are stories that we had of individual people, but we don't really know how much is myth and how much is true. Or we didn't. So a couple of years ago, the Historical Society was thinking about some of the narratives of Newport's founding that are told. And, you know, there's this great story of Quidnick Island being bought by friends of Roger Williams with Roger Williams as assistants, and what was paid was love. And you know, this is lovely story, but we wanted to sort of poke at that a little bit, and we started to, with the help of a summer fellow, go into our archives and take a look at what we actually knew about the earliest interactions between the founders of Newport and the native people they found here. And what we found is a lot more than we thought. We just found that there were all kinds of stories in the archives. It led to a little exhibit that was in the museum that's also now online. And it prompted us to want to do more digging in this regard. Oops. Now I have to figure out how to go back. There we go. So we decided to really dig into looking for evidence of Black and Indigenous people in our manuscript collection. And this was right basically in the middle of COVID. And we had shutdowns and travel restrictions, and we had to ask ourselves if we could do this virtually. We decided that we could, and in fact, we did. We hired 3 graduate students to go through documents that were pre-selected by staff, photographed with an iPhone, and put up on a shared space online. And they started to transcribe these documents and look for, oh, we also sent them equipment if they didn't have it. We sent them 2 screens, and they worked remotely for a summer. And we asked them to look for any reference of any kind of a person who appeared to be of African heritage or Indigenous, and they did. And there are a couple of things about this project in particular that made it less attractive to funders, I have to say. And funding, I'll tell you, was the one real impediment we had to doing this. Everyone else was enthusiastic, including these 3 fellows who have all indicated that they would love to come back and do more. They found the work fascinating for their own research interests and also for what it does to public history. So the work has to be done by people with some training in historical interpretation and in reading 17th and 18th century documents. And one of the criticisms we got was, well, why aren't you just crowdsourcing this? And why isn't the community doing it? Why are you experts having to do it? Well, it's really hard to do. And they required a lot of coaching. We worked in Microsoft Teams space, sometimes working out what the documents were actually saying, where the references were, what the site names actually turned out to be because of eccentric spellings. It was hard work and it required some real training to do it. So they looked at documents, expected documents like this ship's log from, this is very early 1734 from Anamabo. And here are a list of people being bought and sold, no names. These are all recorded in a database that was created this summer. But they also found less expected and amazing documentation. Here is a letter from two named people, Caesar Ballone and Esther Hazard. They're married. They're now living in Preston, Connecticut. They have some relationship to Thomas Hazard of South Kingstown. They're free, but Caesar writes to Hazard to say that a man named John Carter is threatening to kidnap his wife, his child, and even him, and sell them into slavery in 1780. And he is demanding a ransom from Caesar to not do this. And Caesar is savvy enough to know that if he pays that ransom, that's not going to be the end of it. And he's asking Thomas Hazard for help, not to pay it, but to stop him. So here's a little story. What the database does is it has event records and name records, person records, and it will ultimately connect, this is probably too small for you to read, but it will ultimately allow us to connect. For example, if Caesar Ballone turns up in another record, maybe a manumission, or his marriage record, if he got married in the church, or anything else, it allows us to begin to collect and refer these folks to each other. And we have found 1,500 named individuals in a period going from 1650 to about the 1776, the American Revolution, or a little bit later. There are some records from 1780, 1790. We have more, but 1,500 named people and about another 1,500 references where we don't currently have a name. If we can build these biographies even a little, it will change the way we tell these stories, and it will change the way we talk about Newport. I can't think of anything more transformative than this that's being done today. And I'm blowing my staff's horn, not mine. But I just think this work is amazing. And the impediment that you think you have that you're maybe not going to find very much, maybe going to put 15 hours into a project that doesn't yield anything, or 150 hours. I'm guessing it's not just true in our archives. I'm guessing it's true everywhere. And so I'm a real now evangelist for doing this work. We did just get a couple of days ago a grant to continue the work, to fund 6 more months of digging and a new front-end database that will allow us to make this information connected and available online for anyone to use. So for the complaint that we're not using the descendant community to do the work, we are certainly intending to make this information available to not just the descendant community, but anyone who wishes to use it. And I know already that the group that is doing the Middle Passage court marker in Newport is intending to pull some biographies out of this database for use in their project. And in some ways, what could be better than that? And I want to point out too that what we are turning up about folks in the database is so rich and so complete in terms of what people's lives were like and how they dealt with the circumstances in which they found themselves. I feel that in some ways we have dehumanized people who were brought here enslaved twice, once by the act and the second time by not working hard to flesh out these stories. And so there's a real imperative here. We're finding people struggling to marry the person they want to marry, struggling with economic difficulties after being freed, with health issues, with philosophy, with religion, with strategy to try to make their way in the world. It is so rich. So yes, I am a convert to this work in the biggest possible way, and am delighted with this opportunity to encourage others to go at it. And that's it.
Thank you, Ruth, and congratulations on that recent grant as well. That's very, very exciting. And if folks have questions, we're going to hold off on questions until the end, but now it's a pleasure to turn it over to Lauren McCormick, Executive Director at Marblehead Museum.
Hey, everybody. Thank you for having me. I'm coming to you from Marblehead, from the home of the Gnome Keg. Just get this going here, hopefully. It worked before. Well, maybe I'll just leave it up like this. I think you can see the bulk of it, right? Okay, great. I'm getting the thumbs up. So thank you very much for having me again. I appreciate it. And thank you to Nima. So a couple years ago, around the time that a lot of people and institutions were going through a bit of a reckoning, the Marblehead Museum certainly was as well, in that realizing that we were complicit in not telling the full story of our local history and committing to changing that by various means and methodologies. And you know, when Scarlett first asked me to be part of this, I was thrilled, but with the title and sort of how she introduced it, I was kind of like, well, we didn't find a ton in our archive. We have found, as Ruth said, there is a lot to be found, and there are very many ways of finding it. In our archive, we have a few bits and pieces that we've been able to find, and I will say that not everything in the archive has been inventoried recently, so there's probably more to be found as we continue that process. I did pull up, for those of you who might have sort of the same, or at least perceive the same issue. If any of you are in Essex County, there is this great resource that has now been made available about lots of archives in Essex County and what is available, and there is a lot. But a lot of what we've done to research individuals of people, Black, Indigenous, and people of color, has been things that have reached out beyond our archive. And so just a brief list here. If anybody is interested, I have a much fuller, fleshed out hyperlinks, all of that list that I'd be happy to share with you. But there is a lot out there. And it is sometimes more opaque or harder to reach, but I encourage you to do just, I think, as Ruth said, dig deeper, because it is there and there are connections to be made. And you may not find everything just within those records of your community. One thing that's been really interesting and eye-opening to me personally as I've been doing this research is to see how much mobility there was, and how much the community of free and enslaved people of color, especially in the early years before the revolution and afterwards, but particularly before in the 18th century, spread out beyond the sort of political boundaries of Marblehead, right? So, and sometimes that's their own agency, their own individual agency, seeking out family, seeking out friends, seeking out a community that they're not really maybe finding as much in say, in our instance, Marblehead, but also it's forced upon them sometimes. There's one individual that we've found, but this is true for many, that we find him in a record in Lynn, Massachusetts. His marriage record is in Lynn, although we know from other records that he lived in Marblehead. But if we hadn't reached beyond and looked to Lynn, and the reason he was there is because he was enslaved to a man named Jacob Fowle, who lived in Marblehead, but his country estate was in Lynn. And it's things like that, especially when you're dealing with merchants and the upper class. They're mobile, they have people that they're contacting all over. So anyway, if one of the biggest things I've learned here is look outside your town. So just some records here to share with you. And this is certainly not a complete list. And one thing that's been really important for us is to find the runaway or self-emancipating records, because they're so rich in so many ways. I mean, they tell a terrible story in one way, but a positive story in another, you know, seeking your freedom, and also the descriptions. They're just fabulous, and fabulous resources, I should say. And so I encourage you to seek things like that out as a starting point, as a place to start. And, you know, again, going back to what Ruth said, which was such a great opening, is that we have found hundreds of people. And sometimes it's just a name, but oftentimes as we delve into it, we can build those stories. And I'll talk about that a little bit more. The other thing I mentioned earlier, that we don't have a lot in our museum archive. We're not a town institution. We're a private nonprofit, so the town has their own records. And in fact, one thing we find, which was just an amazing record, was what's called the 1788 list of Negroes, but it's really what we kind of refer to it on the side as the warning out list. And not to get too far into the details, but in Massachusetts, at least in the same time period, there were a lot of, there was legislation passed about warning out indigent people, which really broadly became making lists of and warning out a lot of people of color in your community. But the amount of information that we glean about the snapshot in time of the community, it's the list of males, whether they're married, their number of children. And in our situation, which is a completely different topic but very interesting one, is whether they were born in Massachusetts or Rhode Island. So we happen to have a lot of connections to Rhode Island for a number of reasons we don't need to go into now. But, you know, when I first started, before we delved into this research, we had one or two names of individuals. It sounds like Newport Gardner, the same example. We had Joseph and Lucretia Brown here in Marblehead that had been so mythologized. And they were important to the community, but it was two people. Many of the things we thought we knew about them when we actually delved into it were not correct at all. And actually the story became much better when we did dive into it. Their impact in the community, their relationship with each other. I mean, there was so much richness there that we just had to look into it and really discover it. And so part of what we've done is not only do this research, but disseminate it. And like Newport's example, we developed a database thanks to funding from Mass Humanities, where we took these names and those people, we were able to move beyond a name and a date into a story. And this is available on our website right now. There's about 50 people in it now. Much more research needs to be done. We will continue to update it. We made the conscious decision for a number of reasons to make this sort of a more narrative database. So giving a narrative of the information to try to make it more accessible to sort of non-historians or lay people, but at the same time to provide them the information they need or that they might desire, whether they're a teacher or a scholar, to see the actual sources themselves. So in each person's page, we have, in this case, there's only one, but many times there's many sources that they can literally bring up: the census record, the tax record, the letter, whatever it might be. And hopefully that's the sort of layered approach that people will find useful. We've also started a series of interpretive text panels throughout the town, mostly on town property. They just happen to, the subjects, the people, the events that we've chosen to start with mostly fall on town property or the town departments. So we've had to go from department to department and meeting to meeting to get permission to put all these signs in. But the idea is that there'll be between 8 and 10 interpretive panels at places of interest, and then we can build sort of an online presence for them. People can walk around town. It's just a way of disseminating the information. This one in particular is the couple that I mentioned earlier. We had all these ideas about them, but the real story was so much better. And the records were there to be found. We just needed to look. And now that so many of them are digitized, we can move out beyond our town limits and go and find these records and tell these stories. We've also dedicated a page on our website to putting whatever we've found, whether it's a fleshed out version of an individual story, the story of the abolitionists in town, the story of, for instance, there's a map of native settlements in the town that we've been able to figure out where they were, things like that. Even an article about Frederick Douglass's visits to the town. So it's people, it's events, it's things that people might find interesting to review, and we have links to that. And of course, public programming is a big part of that. So sharing this information through lectures, through presentations of various kinds. We've started participating in the Indigenous Peoples Day activities in Marblehead, and my goal is that we don't tell these stories just in February or around Indigenous Peoples Day, but this is a year-round thing for us. This is part of telling the whole history of Marblehead, of our town. And let me just check my time here. The other thing I wanted to bring up is that a very exciting opportunity has come to us that is allowing us and will continue to allow us to really share these stories even more. And what I'm showing you here is, this is our Jeremiah Lee mansion. He was a very wealthy, white, wealthy merchant, built this in 1768. At the same time, he built this smaller brick building, which is ivy covered in this picture. He built it as a detached kitchen, somewhat unusual in the North, but not entirely unheard of course. And also the quarters for his enslaved people. And so we just in 2021 were able to purchase this building. And it offers us very many exciting opportunities. Here are some of the earliest photographs we have, or images we have of the building. Whether it looked like that in Lee's time, we don't know yet, but moving forward, we want to tell these stories using exhibits, using different interpretive strategies than we have before, and having this building really gives us quite an amazing opportunity to do so. So we're very excited. And I know some people on the call are actually familiar with it because we've had conversations about it. So very exciting. Now, we found a lot of support in our community, starting with our board of directors has been overall extremely supportive, especially the president, vice president. So that's been a huge help for us. And I know that some people do not have that. The other place that we've found you'll see support for, you'll see here, community organizations. We have a racial justice team, a task force against discrimination, who are very interested in helping us tell the historical story to help them with the work that they're doing in this day and age. And school system, reaching out to teachers, principals, curriculum supervisors. We're just beginning to develop that, but so far it's been great. The public library has done joint lectures with us and disseminated information for us. And as I said before, because it's such a community story, even outside of our town in particular, just finding other museums and archives and researchers in surrounding communities that are doing the same work is not only helps us with the research, but it's a support mechanism. And we learn so much from them. It's a great give and take. And for us, the results have been overwhelmingly positive. Our sort of general numbers are up. Our fundraising, not just because of this, but in general as well, has been great, has been rising every year. People are going out of their way to thank us for doing this work, which I really appreciate. But yeah, you definitely cannot please everybody. And we do get every once in a while on social media, but more often somebody says to one of our board of directors, hey, well, why are you doing this? Why aren't you telling, you're ignoring the rest of the story. It's kind of ironic. You're ignoring our story. You're ignoring the rest of the story by doing this research. And luckily, because the board has answers for that, they're able to respond to that. But overwhelmingly, it's been very exciting and rewarding. And I'm happy if you reach out to me with any questions. I know we have some time later on as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Lauren. And it's very exciting to have the, second extant slave quarters here in Massachusetts. That's like a really big, massive deal. So congratulations on the purchase of that building as well to have it back on your campus. And now it's a pleasure to turn it over to Dr. Suanna Crowley. And I will turn it over. Thanks.
Good afternoon, everyone. Let me do the sharing screen routine with high hopes that everything works out as we all learn how to deal with the robots in our lives. Let's see. I think everybody can see that. Let me know if you can't. There we go. So indeed, my name is Suanna Crowley, and I'm coming to you both as an independent museum consultant and as the trustee, a longtime trustee for an organization called the Massachusetts Archaeological Society. We are a nonprofit, a statewide nonprofit in Massachusetts that operates the Robbins Museum of Archaeology in Middleborough, Massachusetts, the traditional lands of the Wampanoag peoples. And the organization has been around 83 years. The collection has been around about 83 years. The museum itself, the housing for that collection is only about 75 years old and has moved a couple of times along with its archives. So we have, in addition to doing a lot of interpretive work on the deep cultural stories, the deep in time cultural stories, going back about 15,000 years of archaeology in the Commonwealth. We also have to do the archaeology of ourselves because of all of these moves and because of the history of collecting in the archives in our library and in our general collections. So let me just make the little slide go. Let's make sure we can advance it. Come on, little. There it goes. So we are Mass Archaeology and the Robbins Museum of Archaeology are the smallest of the small on the panel today. Our organization, what we have in geographic reach, we lack in budgetary size or in staffing. So we are an all volunteer organization. The board members are the primary staffers, and I wear many hats across the board as past president, chair of nominating, chair of development. I also second chair marketing, membership, and the museum store. So if there are those among you on such small organizations, I'm here to really sit in awe of larger partners like what Ruth and Lauren have been talking about today, but also to encourage you about the fact that this work with archives and telling stories can be done effectively and efficiently with a much smaller scale reach with an internal organization. So Mass Archaeology, as I said, is the statewide preservation nonprofit. We focus on research, preservation, and on education. 83 years old. And part of our claim to fame is the fact that the early files that were collected by the membership of the Massachusetts Archaeological Society, we call it Mass Archaeology for short, but the society's earliest members, a mix of amateur archaeologists and of professional researchers, historians, archaeologists, they collected a great many files, literally 3x5 cards, which described artifact finds and site locations. Thousands of these cards stacked in enormous teetering piles of information, handwritten. And that was a great part of that preservation movement, and the willingness and interest in trying to capture and preserve what was being found on the landscape and to document it. So that took place from about 1939 into the 50s and 60s, and beginning with some of the major federal and state legislation that crafted Historic Preservation Act, the Mass Archaeological Society's files became the core database for what is known as the Mass Historical Commission, MHC. You may have had dealings with MHC in the past over historic preservation. But our site files became the core, the earliest database of the archives that the Mass Historic Commission retains on the sites of the Commonwealth. There are many thousands of archaeological sites across Massachusetts, and Mass Archaeology sits as an MHC representative, state review board member, as in recognition of that early contribution. I'm the current representative to MHC from this society. But we are very conscious about the fact that site location data, archaeological finds, that's fairly sensitive information. And so in addition to all of the other limitations and restrictions that I'm talking about as a small organization, we also bear the responsibility of protecting those, of conserving those archaeological site files. Archaeological sites, as many of you may know, are non-renewable resources, every bit like fossil fuels. And we don't divulge or try not to divulge really sensitive location information because we are interested in preventing looting and damage to sites, whether out of prospecting or ill-intentioned kinds of perspectives. So we do have a little bit of a struggle in terms of interpreting and documenting what we want to share with the public. We're just cautious. That being said, we do try to find ways to open our doors and create partnerships, and also try to find ways where we can examine and review our archaeological collections and our site files and our archives in ways that we can share with the public a little bit more openly. So the diagram that we have here is kind of a joyful moment out of one summer's work with three high school interns who helped do a very first pass through some of our archives to help us identify what we could talk about in terms of programming and other kinds of outreach. Backing up a little bit of history. So Mass Archaeology being so small and the Robbins Museum being so needy, our organization started to partner with IMLS, Institute of Museum and Library Services, to go through MAP, Museum Assessment Program, and CAP, Collections Assessment Program reviews to try and get a handle on what we have, what we need, and what we can do with all of these resources that we maintain. From those fantastic partnerships and documents, we were able to really map out for ourselves some of the opportunities that we could offer in terms of public outreach and in terms of internal projects that need to keep going. In 2018, right before the pandemic, we partnered with an organization. We're based in Massachusetts, so we partnered with the State Historic Records Advisory Board. If you're familiar with SHRAB, they're an organization that offers both grants and technical assistance. And the roving archivist came into our organization and very diplomatically tisk us. She was very generous with her time and with her advice, and was certainly, I think I'll admit to it, smallest of the small, as we said, shocked at the state of our archives, but very graciously mapped out some very wonderful plans for us in terms of how we could approach our archives and make things more available. So, looking from her advice in 2018, we started to really think strategically about the museum archives with the MAP and the CAP and the SHRAB advice kind of all lined up for our board, also our labor force, our board/labor force. We were able to start to think about how we wanted to talk about what we had, and also kind of interesting to Ruth's point, maybe what we didn't have. So my background is in anthropology, not history. And anthropologists and archaeologists are really taught in the modern era. There are issues in the past, but in the modern era, our training really focuses on social silences and social absences. So people, stories, histories that we know must exist, but for some reason don't, we are automatically curious about. And so that first pass with our joyful group of our interns in 2020 and the good advice from our reviews through 2018 really taught us to think about what's missing and what stories we needed to start investigating and connecting to our archives, to our collections. So let me just pause here for a moment and give you a couple of top 2 practical things that the Robbins Museum has contributed to, and 3 new places where we're kind of moving forward. The first 2, federal and state review and compliance and master's and doctoral research projects, have been the traditional outlet for our archival records. Part of the responsibility of archaeology in response to federal and state compliance, things like the Section 106, if you're familiar with that kind of review, National Historic Preservation Act, National Environmental Protection Act, and the state laws that follow, is to be able to really do deep research across the state. If you are charged with excavations or any kind of impact for development, you want to be able to make sure you've got the fullest amount of data that you can on what resources, historic and environmental, might be impacted. And the Robbins Museum has traditionally responded to requests from professional researchers in the review and compliance field about site location data. That is sort of a peer-to-peer review, and we do share site location data with those professionals in historic preservation compliance work. Secondarily, we've also really contributed a lot to master's and doctoral research work. We do allow students on a limited basis to come in and be able to review the archives. In many cases, we're able to actually partner with them for help in helping to organize our archives because they too offer very diplomatic tisks when they walk in to see us. But combined with our very extensive library of rare materials, we're able to offer some very unique resources to master's and doctoral students who are looking at the deep history and cultural heritage across the state and across New England. Now, our work in pandemic, as one of those small organizations that almost didn't make it through the pandemic, I'll tell you right now, we do not break a 6-figure budget ever. We're close to half of that. We're a tiny organization, but we have a lot of energy. And as we reviewed our archives and had this good partnerships with these different kinds of consultants, we were really able to say there's a great deal of work we have to do internally. We have to shape up the organization of our archives, make them more accessible to review and compliance, to students who are doing research projects, but also be able to connect those dots. Those wonderful databases that Lauren and Ruth showed you are tremendous ways of connecting dots, and we need to build those. In our case, we looked at the negative space. We looked at what was absent, and we started to build programming and outreach, and in the very early stages now, exhibit planning around what we weren't telling, what we weren't talking about. And that inspired a big push in 2020 and 2021 with my colleague, Lindsay Randall of the Robert S. Peabody Institute of Archaeology. They're based at Phillips Academy in Andover. Together, we really partnered on creating digital programming that started to look not just at the stories, underrepresented histories and research, but at scholars themselves who are marginalized from conversations, and begin to put the two together in front of our audience. Big pivot. This is a traditionally very white, middle class to affluent membership, board makeup. We're moving in better directions, certainly at the board level, but definitely we have issues and we're working on them. But together, my colleague and I really decided to pivot hard and fast into controversial topics and start presenting them through very accessible means. So we developed a conversation series called Digging In, where we highlighted scholars and we're able to connect them to our community. We anticipated the pushback, but we did not get it. We actually had warm receptions from our membership who were thrilled to say, and coming to us saying, why haven't you ever told this to us before? Why haven't we ever seen this before? And we were able to really discover an appetite for these new stories. And certainly thrilled to be able to highlight scholars, young scholars, many of them, young scholars of color, who were being either ignored by the Academy or pushed out of the Academy. And we were providing a platform on which to deliver that information. From our digging in relationships, we started to really realize that we had opportunities for programming or for partnership programs and advanced research that would bring information to the public. And from digging in, we are now taking that, excuse me, negative space in our own archives. We are now pivoting toward a new partnership program that was just funded by the Massachusetts Office of Travel and Tourism, an MOTT grant. And that is for the build out of something we're calling the Mass Archaeology Trail. And this is going to be a statewide trail of partners that we're not focusing on sites. We're not going to direct people's attention and drive them up to the edge of an archaeological site and in any way encourage damage or looting to any of those places. We're looking to build out partnerships with organizations that are telling histories related to archaeology that start to map and deliver the timeline on this rich history from multiple communities across the state. So Indigenous communities, African-American communities, Latino communities, et cetera. This build is in very new stages. We hope to have a pilot program out in the fall and start building sort of year 2, year 3 as a tourism trail, as a trail for people to encounter in a digital space and start to see this interconnected web of histories through deep time. And the last piece that we've really started to think about our archives for is that fundraising piece. And fundraising is tricky. I spend a lot of my time as a consultant doing grant writing and communication that helps that fundraising go. And as a volunteer passion project person for the Mass Archaeological Society, trying to connect those dots is very tricky. But I recently delivered a webinar to a national archaeology organization. And the really questions are what revolved around BIPOC histories and other histories and where the fundraising is coming from. So there are some opportunities to, you don't want to chase too far and go too far from your mission, but there's some opportunities above and beyond Mass Humanities and Mass Cultural Council to start telling interesting stories. So just very quickly, I'll reassure everyone that it doesn't need to be perfect to be useful. This is our roving archivist meeting with 2 of our trustees back in 2018, and you can kind of see the state of some of the archives. Some of it is organized, some of it is still in boxes, and we fully recognize the need to get better. And we fully recognize the need that these are untapped resources that our fundraising, our programming, and our partnerships are going to start help us telling and giving more people access to. But in order to do that, it's about resources. And to that end, just because I do spend so much time thinking about, mulling over, worrying about funding, I pulled together a list of resources that I've gone back to that I'd be happy to share with Scarlett through a PDF. And these are national grant programs that are coming online or available online that might be able to offer institutions within the NEMA audience some additional resources. Some you may have heard of, some you may have not heard of. Certainly if you are involved in African American history, and in particular burying grounds and cemeteries for enslaved peoples or freed peoples that are locations that have been adversely affected by development or other kinds of damage. There's new federal legislation similar to NAGPRA, which is being debated. And we anticipate that will pass and that there will be a considerable amount of funding following to help address those particular resources and those particular histories. So this is a little list of national grant programs and ones that you can track down. As I said, I'll share this with Scarlett. And these are more regional grant programs. I did not include Mass Humanities and Mass Cultural Council in this. I was aiming for partners that maybe people didn't know about. And so in this case, for Massachusetts Library Commissioners and the SHRAB organization. So trying to think as a scrappy, motivated, under-resourced organization that has lots of energy and lots of enthusiasm for telling these stories and building the networks to make sure they're told properly is kind of the mass archaeology perspective. And so with that, I'd love to connect with anybody that might have any other questions or is just aching for a private tour of the Robbins Museum in Middleborough at any time. So thank you.
Thank you so much, and congratulations on that tourism grant too, and very exciting for fall 2022. And yes, I've been following that news around kind of that NAGPRO law around African American burial grounds as well. It's really exciting. Before I ask my questions, I want to open it up to our audience and attendees. Feel free to unmute yourselves if you have a question. You can type it in the chat. I'm going to be quiet for a minute and let somebody else ask a question if they'd like. So feel free to go ahead and unmute. And if no one has any questions, I do have a few that I can ask. I'd love to know a little bit more. It looks like all three of our sites utilized interns or fellows. And I was wondering if our speakers could just talk a little bit more about, oh, Michelle, you have a question. I'm going to ask my internship question and then we'll go to you. So how did you find your interns or your fellows? And then we'll turn it over to Michelle.
We have a 15-year program of hiring summer fellows and also sometimes longer-term visiting curators through an endowed program that the NHS has. So there was an easy route in. We advertise among graduate programs and got for this project, I think, the most qualified, most interesting applicants we've had in 15 years. So it does say something about what young scholars are interested in doing right now.
We are lucky in that we are next town over from Salem State University, which has an undergrad and graduate program in history. So we are often able to snag some great interns for that. I will say that there, some things that have been problematic with interns and volunteers even is it is, I think Ruth, you spoke to this earlier, it is some hard materials to get into sometimes, and in some cases, especially when it's not clear cut. And undergrad interns sometimes can't read the text, the handwriting from the 18th and the 17th especially period. So that's thrown up some barriers. So it's been hard, and I will say that the bulk of the research so far, it's been me.
So we have lots of networks through archaeological programs across the state, and sometimes we're fortunate enough to have source our interns from Bridgewater State or UMass Dartmouth. And we are very conscious about the fact that we don't have much to compensate them with just financially. So we try to also be good partners in networking those students, particularly ones who want to go in public history and archaeology, opening up our own networks to make sure that we're being very good partners and very thankful to them and helping to promote and forward their careers. We do have high school interns that will partner with us on occasion. A little side note about sort of those age gaps. We tend to allow our interns to help us within our paper archives or our library. We really, as a board, have withheld access to the collections themselves. And the reason is that we are going through a NAGPRO process and we are discovering things. And out of respect for the tribe's expectations, we are making sure that only tribal members or Secretary of Interior qualified archaeologists are handling any of the objects inside of the collections. So the paper collections, we do have sort of inadvertent discoveries that are sometimes a little hard for teenagers to process and understand, particularly if they have reference to graves and burials into the documentation. But we do definitely try to restrict the other kind of access to the harder materials. But, you know, what a fantastic time to bring interns in to your organization, to encourage them. I've even sat down with them and said, all right, today's our last meeting. Let's write your resume. Let's do this and make sure you know exactly how to quantify and qualify your experience with the Robbins Museum so that you can use it in the future.
Thanks, Michelle. Would you like to ask a question?
Yes, thank you. I just want to say thanks to all of the panelists for sharing everything you're working on. It's really exciting to see and understand how each of your organizations have approached the projects that you're working on. I did want to ask if you would be willing to share you know, the resources that you displayed, particularly the ones about for research and also for grants. I think that would be great information to have, to be able to, on my part, also pass forward to others. So I just wanted to request that. And then I'll just add, that's very interesting, Lauren, about people not being able to read the handwriting. And I kind of wonder if that's part of the discontinuation of teaching cursive. You know, I don't know. It's just, I found that kind of interesting. So just a comment.
I do think it is that they're just not taught cursive. I mean, we know it's hard, you know, but as you do it, you learn to recognize the writing and all. But if you don't have any place to start from, really, I do think that's hard. We've had high school interns or high school people who have wanted to volunteer, and you know, you just have to find certain things they can do with, you know, typewritten materials.
Yeah.
And we can definitely share resources after. And this is being recorded, so everyone will get the recording as well. Kate, I saw you unmute. Did you have a question?
Yeah, I was just going to ask if, thank you. This was really neat to see what everyone's working on. And I was wondering if there's any, if oral history plays any role in the work that all of you have been doing and how you incorporate that and think through all the complexities of using that.
Hi, Kate. Nice to see you. I'll take that. I know that Lauren and Ruth may want to jump in. One of the projects that I didn't talk about specifically is one that's based in oral history, and it's an interesting merger of oral history and archaeology. And that has to do with a World War II site on Cape Cod. It's called Washburn Island, connected to Camp Edwards. And if you're at all familiar with the phrase Cape Cod Commandos, this is the earliest group of military service people who were involved in learning how to do the amphibious vehicles that stormed the beaches at Normandy. So we do have a handful of still living veterans, 99, 100, and 101 years old. And they have been willing to talk to us and help us start to reconstruct the site of Washburn Island and talk about the activities that were going on there. And this is a grant funded through the SHRAB Veterans Grant Program. So it's a really interesting opportunity to merge what we're seeing on the landscape as cultural material and sites and features, and also be able to really tell the story quite intimately, partly their oral histories, partly archives. This is a really distinct moment, 1942. Tens of thousands of people have been drafted and are now, if you can imagine it, landing in Cape Cod on a top secret mission. And we have African-American troops, we have Latino troops, we have letters home, we have photographs, we have this really rich, newly declassified set of materials to start talking about a really interesting history. So they can And I think that at least with our oral histories, we're trying to build them in the right way, to put them into the archive in exactly the right way the first time. So no backup process.
We have not gotten to that point yet, Kate, but it's a great question. It actually makes me think of something that's been on my radar that we haven't also done, which is working to find descendants, to really sort of, you know, trace down to today if we can, which I know will be hard, but I think that would be fantastic. But yeah, definitely something to think more on. Thank you.
Yeah.
Ruth, are you? I can't. I think you're on mute.
Sorry, I normally if I hold the space bar down, it unmutes me, but it failed. We're hoping this project will help us identify descendants of the enslaved people in Newport County. Right now, the sense is that very few are still local. We have a really big, thriving African-American community, most of whom came up after the Civil War. And we have done some oral histories about 20th century history, but we haven't done any in a really long time. And it's a topic that comes up on a regular basis that, you know, in some ways now is the time for some of these communities.
Well, and it's interesting too, I think, Lauren, with your signage, I think I saw QR codes in the bottom left corner on some of them, and how technology or websites or oral histories can kind of be activated, you know, looking at a static exhibit sign, but then maybe using your phone, you'll be able to kind of activate that space with those QR codes, which is really exciting. Briggs, I see you unmuted. Do you have a question?
I do. I'm curious about the databases that you mentioned. Did you have them designed for your specific use, or did you have to get donations and grants to tailor or buy databases? That's part of a stumbling block for us, you know, and how do you manage the information you have so diligently unearthed? So if you could help me with that, that'd be lovely.
We have a collections database with a front end and a back end that was written for us on open source software that's been highly successful for our use. And you can access the object and a small amount of the photograph collection online right now, but it does not have the kind of deep and relational people capacity that we're looking for. So the grant that we just got was basically to go back to the company and have them build that in, so that we can take the data we've collected in these elaborate spreadsheets and ingest it into a relational database that will have a front end that can be online. And it's not cheap, and it hasn't been easy to get the money for a variety of reasons that always surprise me. But it is in place, and we'll go forward now. We made a decision long time ago not to buy collection software out of a box, which I'm grateful for, but building that custom database hasn't been easy either, frankly. It's like there's no good answer here. I wanted to say also that a subset of our data will get also uploaded into enslaved.org, which is the national database. And we've been working with them since the beginning to make sure that what we collected could be easily added to their database. And Lauren, I'm so taken with your comment that we can't stop at our borders because people were mobile. That is so true. I mean, I put up something that, you know, was South Kingstown and not Newport at all, and yet it landed in our archive.
Yeah, and we have actually a lot of people who moved from North and South Kingstown to Marblehead, so go figure. Anyway,
Yes, you did.
we did, a lot of them. But as far as our database, we did receive a digital capacities grant from Mass Humanities, which I'm not, and I don't know if you're in Massachusetts, sorry, but
No.
no, okay. Well, I would tell you, we spent, I believe it was either 32 or 3,500, just to give you a sense. It was all grant funded because we wouldn't have had a lot of that money. We don't have a lot to play with, very small institution. So what we did is we worked with somebody who could manipulate the open source. I don't understand any of this, honestly. He basically, he and I worked together to figure out what this database would look like. Ours is different than, like, say, Ruth's. And part of that was because we didn't have sort of the capacity to really do a really good relational database. But we worked together to sort of figure out what the fields would be. He set up in what's called Visual Studio Code, something where I could literally just input and then it would populate. And the other thing that he did was figure out, using just the sub page of our website, which was free, we didn't have to pay extra for it. We just used WordPress for our website, a sub page that the Visual Studio Code would populate. Sorry about the phone ringing.
Thank you. Thank you.
I also know for folks just getting started with this work too, like Excel spreadsheet, can be really easy way to just start, and, or Google Sheets. So sometimes you don't need to go right to the big bucks, expensive software. Just, starting the work with an Excel spreadsheet can be really helpful too. It looks like we have a question in the chat. Linda was wondering how you can make the information accessible to the public. We're uploading our archives into Past Perfect, but are not really sure of the next steps.
We had what's called a Marblehead Memories project, completely separate from this. It was sort of gathering 20th century stories, and we have Past Perfect as well. And long story, everything that's actually a collections object, whether it's a photograph, an archival piece, or whatever, is in the objects catalog. So that opened up 3 extra catalogs in Past Perfect. So we grabbed the archives catalog, imported everything in that. And the only reason I say that is then we used their website, a Past Perfect's collections database online website, which is, you can manipulate it to look and do what you want it to do. So if there's some way to take what you have in your archival set that you've inputted and work with Past Perfect to get it onto their website function, that might be one way of spreading the information.
We started our work with Past Perfect, I don't know, I want to say 15 years ago, pretty soon after I got to the Historical Society. And I'm kind of a big fan because it's very cost effective and very, it'll take you pretty far. We did outgrow it as we got more collections information together and wanted more sophisticated things, but we used it for a good long number of years. And I agree, they do provide an online option to provide your information to the public, which if you have to build your own, it's complicated.
I was just going to say, we've been using Past Perfect. We are far from perfect in using it. And as a group of volunteers, we have to keep sort of, some of us maintain that software institutional memory and have to keep passing it on, but even we feel a little not up to the task in many ways. But I have to say that really working with the interns over the last couple of years has been very instructive in terms of learning what the new platforms are, learning where sort of Gen Z and millennials are interested in finding information, interested in interacting with organizations. And to that extent, mass archaeology is starting to move into some innovative places, not just our Zoom programming, not just our robust and fun YouTube channel, where we deposit all of our conversational series and lecture series. But we're really starting to look at, through some work I've been doing as a consultant, looking at smart speaker technology. And smart speakers are in about 50% of homes right now. That's about 100 million devices are sitting out there. And they're in cars, they're coming to hotels. And we've started to design and plan some operational outputs for the society that are going to be able to deliver content, deliver marketing information, and also deliver fundraising information, because a lot of the work that I do is that pure fundraising. So part of the grant from Mass Office of Travel Tourism is to start putting Mass Archaeology Trail out into very accessible platforms. And those are just, small steps to be more accessible, more inclusive, but we're kind of excited to take them and see where this younger generation of interns is going to help us go.
And to your kind of thoughts around the Alexas or the smart speakers of the future, can the speakers speak a little bit to like social media accessibility? I know that can tie in a little bit to thinking about how we share those archives with those different groups.
So the vast majority of the sort of materials that are available on Alexa are really marketing. It's like an audio Yelp system. A few organizations like mine, Mass Archaeology and the Peel in Baltimore, are starting to put the content and building out those fundraising pieces. Integrating them into social media, I think is kind of the next step. And I'm working with a homegrown Massachusetts tech company to experiment with where we don't just put the marketing messages of small businesses, but put the marketing messages of nonprofits, or those ways of connecting with audiences into nonprofits as special mission-based organizations. So I hope we can do better, go further than social media, but 2022 is kind of a pivotal year for smart speaker technology, and it's sort of an undiscovered country, which is exciting to an archaeologist, moving from the known into the unknown, and I think we're kind of excited to see where this particular media will take us.
I would just say that, social media is a great opportunity to share the small discoveries. Any
Agreed.
little thing. You can put it up on Facebook, Instagram. I've been told I need to start doing TikTok, which I don't do even personally. So, but Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, small discoveries, little stories. It's a great way to share and show people you're doing the work.
Great, thank you. Any other questions out there? I know, Suanna, you mentioned the roving archivist project. I know here in Massachusetts, we have a roving archivist. Connecticut, I think, has one, and I believe Maine has one as well. Ruth, I don't know if Rhode Island, yeah. But can you speak a little bit just to that roving archivist a little bit more?
Sure. So the State Historic Records Advisory Board, SHRAB, I always have to think of that very slowly. It's one of those funny acronyms. They are the advisory board for the Massachusetts State Archives, and they receive funding from the Mass General Court, from the Mass Legislature. And they provide, as I said, technical assistance as well as grant assistance. Their technical wing is the roving archivist, and you can apply to have consultation by the roving archivist. That usually involves you doing kind of an overview of what the state of your archives are and what you would be looking for in terms of help. And then if selected, the roving archivist comes to your site and spends the better part of a day really walking through the boxes, the drawers, the stacks that you have on site, and giving you some really good insights into current best practices. That's not the way to store that material. That's not the way you organize it logically. Here are the better ways to do it. So you get back a very hefty technical report stocked full of funding resources, catalog resources for raw materials to make the storage better, advice and partnership opportunities with other larger organizations that are connected to the National Archives or professional organizations. So we had a fabulous time with the roving archivist and SHRAB as both a recipient of the technical assistance and then as a recipient for the Veterans Grant Program. But boy, oh boy, just like IMLS, you stay on their list forever and they just keep inviting you back. So if you try for it, it's a wonderful way to stay connected, even if now isn't the right time to jump on that. You don't have the staffing, you don't have the energy, you don't have the wherewithal. There are other opportunities because you will stay on their list and you may find the timing to be right in the future.
Thank you so much. Well, if nobody else in the audience has any final questions, I have one before we say goodbye, which would be, if we were to meet here in a year, what do our speakers hope that their site has either accomplished or shared or given back to the community? So I'll let you all think for a minute because I didn't tell you about that one. But while our speakers are thinking, I do just want to say thanks to all our participants and attendees today. The NEMA conference is this November, and I invite everyone to participate, but I'm going to open it back up to the speakers to say, if we meet again in a year, what will your site have done? What would you be sharing?
I hope, I expect that we'll have our front end database of all of this information that we found up and available, and that people will be using it for a variety of things. I also hope we'll have an opportunity to create some of the narrative biographies that Marblehead has done, and have those, maybe on the streets, so that I mean, I think our intention at this point is to really change the experience of thinking about Newport history for the 2 million visitors, for scholars, for every, grandiose, sure.
I hope we have another 50 names in the database, because I know that we know the names. I shouldn't say that, the stories, the stories for another 50, but also, so much of what we're going to be doing is going to be around our new building and changing how we approach, I'm not sure how to say this, how we approach telling the story that we used to tell in the Jeremiah Lee Mansion House, and altering the lens that we through which the visitors see that, and everything that we've been working on will inform that.
I'm really hoping that the story for mass archaeology is one that helps to build some gravitational pull around our trail process, that we're able to provide a framework for other sites and venues to share, a sort of a slice of their story, the archaeology story, but also to rebalance the equation between this entertainment Indiana Jones factor around archaeology, which is wonderful and inspiring, but not the whole story. And that we are able to really message around the presence of the communities that remain, particularly indigenous communities who are still here, and also to really message around conservation and preservation of archaeological and cultural resources. So I hope in a year I can invite you all to a glorious digital map and send you on fantastic adventures across the state to learn about archaeology.
Well, those all sound wonderful. And thank you all so much for spending your afternoon with us. Thank you, attendees. Thank you, wonderful speakers. Like I said, NEMA conference, November 2nd to 4th. I hope everyone can join us. But otherwise, look for an email. We'll send the recording. We'll send some of the resources and links shared. And we really appreciate everybody taking the time today for this workshop. So have a wonderful rest of your afternoon. Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, Nima.
Thanks.